You know what's really strange? When most people think about the biggest wars of the 20th century, they think about World War I, World War II, maybe Vietnam. But there's this massive conflict that happened right between World War II and Vietnam that somehow just slipped through the cracks of our collective memory. A war where nearly 5 million people died. A war that came terrifyingly close to triggering World War III. A war that technically never even ended. And yet, if you ask the average person on the street about it, you'll probably get a blank stare. I'm talking about the Korean War, and there's a reason it's called the Forgotten Conflict. But here's the thing, understanding this war is absolutely crucial to understanding the world we live in today. The tensions between North and South Korea, the nuclear standoff that keeps us all on edge, even the entire structure of modern East Asian politics. So today we're going to dive deep into this forgotten war, and I promise you by the end of this video, you're going to understand why this conflict matters so much more than you ever realized. Let me paint you a picture. It's June 25th, 1950. The sun is just rising over the Korean Peninsula. Families are waking up, starting their day, completely unaware that their entire world is about to be turned upside down. And then, at 4 in the morning, the silence is shattered. North Korean artillery opens fire across the 38th parallel, the line that divided Korea into two zones after World War II. Within hours, over 100,000 North Korean troops are pouring across the border in a massive invasion. Tanks are rolling, planes are bombing, and the South Korean forces, caught completely off guard, are in full retreat. This is how the Korean War begins, sudden, brutal, and devastating. But to really understand this war, we need to rewind a bit. We need to go back to 1945, to the end of World War II. Japan had controlled Korea as a colony for 35 years, and when Japan surrendered in August 1945, Korea was suddenly free. The problem was, nobody could agree on what to do with this newly liberated country. The United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers that emerged from World War II, decided to temporarily divide Korea along the 38th parallel. The Soviets would accept the Japanese surrender in the north, and the Americans would do the same in the south. It was supposed to be temporary, just a practical arrangement to handle the logistics of Japan's surrender. But you know how these temporary arrangements go. What was meant to last a few months ended up defining the fate of an entire nation for decades. In the north, the Soviets installed a communist government led by a young revolutionary named Kim Il-sung. Now, Kim Il-sung was an interesting character. He'd spent years fighting Japanese occupation, first in Korea and then as part of a guerrilla unit in Manchuria, and later with the Soviet army. The Soviets saw him as the perfect person to lead a communist Korea. He was Korean. He had revolutionary credentials, and he was loyal to Moscow. In the South, the Americans backed Syngman Rhee, a staunchly anti-communist politician who'd spent decades in exile advocating for Korean independence. Rhee was just as authoritarian as Kim Il-sung in many ways, but he was anti-communist, and in the emerging Cold War, that was enough for the Americans. So by 1948, you had two separate governments claiming to be the legitimate government of all Korea. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north and the Republic of Korea in the south. Each leader wanted to reunify the country under their system. Each believed they had the right to rule all of Korea. And both were willing to use force to make it happen. The stage was set for disaster. Now Kim Il-sung wasn't stupid. He knew he couldn't just invade the South without backing from the big communist powers. So throughout 1949 and early 1950, he's traveling to Moscow and Beijing, meeting with Stalin and Mao Zedong, trying to get their approval for an invasion. And this is where it gets really interesting from a historical perspective. For a long time, historians debated who was really responsible for the war. Was it Stalin pulling the strings? Was it Kim Il-sung pushing for it? Were the Chinese involved? Thanks to documents that came out after the fall of the Soviet Union, We now know more about what actually happened. Stalin was initially cautious. He didn't want a direct confrontation with the United States. But by early 1950, a few things had changed his calculus. First, the Soviets had successfully tested their first atomic bomb in 1949, so they weren't as intimidated by American nuclear monopoly anymore. Second, and this is huge, the Chinese Civil War had just ended with a communist victory. Mao Zedong had proclaimed the People's Republic of China in October 1949. Suddenly, the Communists had a massive new ally in Asia. And third, the American Secretary of State, D. Nixon, gave a speech in January 1950, where he outlined the American defensive perimeter in Asia. And here's the kicker. He didn't mention Korea. Stalin and Kim Il-sung interpreted this as a signal that the Americans wouldn't defend South Korea. So Stalin gave Kim the green light, with one condition: Mao had to agree to support the operation if things went wrong. Mao was initially hesitant. China had just come out of decades of war, first against Japan and then a brutal civil war. The country was exhausted, the economy was in shambles. The last thing Mao wanted was another war. But he was also a communist revolutionary, ideologically committed to supporting other communist movements, and he couldn't afford to look weak in front of Stalin, so reluctantly he agreed. If North Korea got in trouble, China would help. With these assurances in place, Kim Il-sung began preparing for invasion. The North Korean military in 1950 was actually pretty formidable. They had about 135,000 well-trained troops, many of whom had fought in the Chinese Civil War and then returned to Korea. They had hundreds of Soviet tanks, the T-34, which was one of the best tanks of World War II. They had artillery, they had air support. The South Korean military, by contrast, was much weaker. They had about 95,000 troops, but they were poorly equipped and poorly trained. They had no tanks, virtually no air force, and their heaviest weapons were mortars and small artillery pieces. The Americans had deliberately kept the South Korean military weak because they were worried Syngman Rhee might try to invade the North. Ironic, right? In trying to prevent one war, they made another war much easier. So when North Korea attacks on June 25, 1950, the South Koreans are simply overwhelmed. Within 3 days, Seoul, the capital, has fallen. South Korean forces are in chaotic retreat. Thousands of soldiers are surrendering or just abandoning their positions. Refugees are clogging the roads, fleeing south to escape the advancing North Korean army. It looks like the war might be over in a matter of weeks. Kim Il-sung is convinced he'll reunify Korea under communist rule by August. But then the international community responds, and this is where the Korean War becomes something much bigger than a civil war. It becomes a proxy war between the communist and capitalist worlds. President Harry Truman, sitting in Washington, has to make a decision. Does America intervene, or does it let Korea fall to communism? Now you have to understand the context here. This is 1950. The Cold War is just getting started. The Soviets have the atomic bomb. China has just gone communist. There's this theory called the domino theory, the idea that if one country falls to communism, neighboring countries will follow like dominoes. Truman and his advisors believe that if they let South Korea fall without a fight, it'll embolden communists everywhere. Japan might be threatened. The entire American position in Asia could collapse. So Truman makes the call. America will intervene, but he does something clever politically. Instead of asking Congress to declare war, which would be controversial and time-consuming, he goes to the United Nations. And here's a lucky break for the Americans. The Soviet Union is currently boycotting the UN Security Council over the issue of Chinese representation. They want Communist China to have the seat instead of nationalist Taiwan. Because the Soviets aren't there to veto it, the UN Security Council passes a resolution condemning North Korea's invasion and calling for member states to assist South Korea. Suddenly, this isn't just an American war, it's a UN police action. 15 other countries will eventually send troops, though the Americans will provide the vast majority of forces. The US military scrambles to respond. The problem is, America has demobilized massively since World War II ended 5 years earlier. The troops that are closest are stationed in Japan, and they're soft, undertrained, and equipped with leftover World War II gear. The first American unit to enter combat is Task Force Smith, about 400 men with a couple of artillery pieces, and they're rushed to Korea with orders to slow down the North Korean advance. They take up positions near a town called Osan on July 5, 1950. When the North Korean tanks and infantry come rolling down the road, Task Force Smith opens fire, and their shells literally bounce off the teeth. 4 tanks. The Americans are forced to retreat after a few hours of fighting. It's a disaster. It's a preview of how the next few weeks are going to go. For the rest of July and into August, the American and South Korean forces are in continuous retreat. The North Koreans are pushing them further and further south. At one point, it looks like the Communists are going to push the UN forces right off the Korean Peninsula. But then, the UN forces manage to establish a defensive perimeter around the port city of Pusan in the far southeast corner of Korea. This becomes known as the Pusan Perimeter, and it's where the UN forces make their stand. For weeks, there's brutal fighting along this perimeter. The North Koreans are throwing everything they have at it, trying to break through and capture Pusan. If they take Pusan, the UN forces will have no port to receive supplies and reinforcements, and the war will be over, but the UN forces hold, barely. They're reinforced with fresh troops and equipment arriving by ship. American air power starts to take a toll on North Korean supply lines. The North Koreans are overextended, fighting at the end of long supply lines, and they're starting to run out of steam. The front stabilizes. And while this is happening, General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of UN forces, is planning something audacious. MacArthur is one of the most controversial figures in American military history. He's a brilliant strategist, a genuine war hero from World War II. He's also incredibly arrogant, has a massive ego, and isn't great at taking orders from civilians. But in September 1950, MacArthur pulls off one of the most daring amphibious assaults in military history. He decides to land forces at Incheon, a port city near Seoul, deep behind North Korean lines. Almost everyone thinks this is a terrible idea. The tides at Incheon are extreme, some of the highest in the world. There's only a brief window each day when landing craft can get to shore. The harbor is narrow and easily defended. Military planners give the operation a tiny chance of success. MacArthur insists it'll work precisely because it's so risky the North Koreans will never expect it. On September 15, 1950, the Incheon landing happens, and it works. The North Koreans are caught completely by surprise. Within days, UN forces have recaptured Seoul. The North Korean army, which had been besieging the Pusan perimeter, suddenly finds itself cut off from its supply lines and trapped. The entire military situation reverses almost overnight. North Korean units start surrendering or fleeing north in disarray. By early October, UN forces have pushed the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel. The original goal of defending South Korea has been achieved, and this is where a crucial decision gets made, one that will dramatically escalate the war. Do the UN forces stop at the 38th parallel, or do they push north and try to reunify Korea under the South Korean government? MacArthur and Syngman Rhee are pushing hard to continue north. President Truman and his advisors are tempted. The military situation looks favorable. If they can reunify Korea now, it would be a major Cold War victory. The UN General Assembly passes a resolution supporting the reunification of Korea. So in early October, UN forces cross the 38th parallel and drive deep into North Korea. By late October, they're approaching the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. Some American units actually reach the river. Victory seems within reach, but there's a problem, a big problem. Throughout October, the Chinese have been sending warnings through diplomatic back channels. They're telling anyone who will listen that if UN forces approach the Chinese border, China will intervene. MacArthur dismisses these warnings. He thinks the Chinese are bluffing. He tells Truman that even if China does intervene, American air power will destroy any Chinese forces that try to cross the Yalu River. Truman flies to Wake Island in the Pacific to meet with MacArthur on October 15th, and MacArthur reassures him that the war will be over by Thanksgiving. Chinese intervention is unlikely, and even if it happens, it won't change the outcome. MacArthur is wrong, catastrophically wrong. The Chinese aren't bluffing. In fact, they've already intervened. In mid-October, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops have secretly crossed the Yalu River and are hiding in the mountains of North Korea. They're moving at night, hiding during the day, maintaining strict radio silence. American reconnaissance flights see nothing. The Chinese are using tactics they perfected during their Civil War: infiltration, camouflage, moving without being detected. By late October, there are over 300,000 Chinese soldiers in North Korea, and the UN forces have no idea they're there. On October 25th, the Chinese spring their trap. They launch massive surprise attacks on UN forces across the front. American and South Korean units are suddenly fighting not just remnants of the North Korean army, but huge numbers of fresh Chinese troops. The fighting is fierce. The Chinese use human wave attacks, sending masses of infantry forward, often at night, attacking with bugles and whistles to create chaos and fear. UN forces are caught off guard and forced to retreat. But then, after a few days of fighting, the Chinese suddenly break contact and disappear back into the mountains. It's strange. It's like they're testing the UN forces, seeing how they'll react. MacArthur still doesn't get it. He thinks these are just Chinese volunteers, not regular Chinese army units. He orders UN forces to continue advancing. He launches what he calls the Home by Christmas offensive in late November, designed to reach the Yalu River and end the war. And that's when disaster strikes. On November 25th and 26th, the Chinese launch a massive offensive. Suddenly, UN forces are being hit from all sides by overwhelming numbers of Chinese troops. It's not thousands of Chinese volunteers. It's hundreds of thousands of regular Chinese army soldiers. The UN forces are in danger of being completely surrounded and destroyed. What follows is one of the most harrowing retreats in American military history. At a place called the Chosin Reservoir, about 20,000 US Marines and soldiers find themselves surrounded by about 120,000 Chinese troops in the middle of a brutal Korean winter. Temperatures are dropping to 20 below zero, sometimes even colder. Weapons are freezing. Medical supplies are freezing. Men are getting frostbite, and they're fighting constantly, trying to break through Chinese encirclement and reach the coast. The Marines fight their way out over 17 days in what becomes known as the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. When they reach the port of Hungnam, they've taken heavy casualties, but they've survived and brought out their dead and wounded with them. It's a fighting retreat, not a rout, but it's still a retreat. All across North Korea, UN forces are falling back. By late December, they've been pushed back below the 38th parallel. On January 4, 1951, the Chinese capture Seoul. In just a few weeks, the UN forces have gone from the brink of total victory to the edge of complete defeat. It's a stunning reversal. The Chinese intervention has completely changed the war. This isn't a police action anymore. This is a major conflict between Chinese and American forces, and everyone's scared about what it might become. See, There's a real fear that this war is going to escalate into World War III. MacArthur wants to expand the war. He wants to bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria. He wants to blockade the Chinese coast. He wants to use nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan to open a second front. Some of his suggestions even include using atomic bombs against Chinese troops or cities. Truman and his advisors are horrified. They're trying to keep this war limited. They don't want to start World War III over Korea. Relations between Truman and MacArthur deteriorate. MacArthur starts publicly criticizing Truman's strategy. He's giving interviews and making statements that contradict administration policy. In April 1951, Truman has had enough. He fires MacArthur. It's a huge controversy. MacArthur is a national hero, and many Americans are outraged that Truman would fire him. MacArthur comes home to a ticker tape parade and addresses Congress, but Truman stands firm. Civilian control of the military is a fundamental principle, and generals don't get to make foreign policy. MacArthur fades from public life, and General Matthew Ridgway takes over command of UN forces in Korea. Ridgway is a different kind of commander. He's less flashy than MacArthur, but he's an excellent tactician. Under his leadership, UN forces stabilize the front. They stop the Chinese offensives. By spring of 1951, UN forces are pushing north again, but this time there's no talk of reunifying Korea by force. The goal now is to push the front line back to somewhere near the 38th parallel and then negotiate an end to the war. By summer of 1951, the front has stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel. And in July 1951, peace talks begin. You might think that's good news. The fighting is going to end. Right, wrong. The peace talks drag on for 2 years, and during that entire time, the war continues. Soldiers are fighting and dying for hills and ridges that have no strategic value except as bargaining chips in the peace negotiations. This phase of the war is grinding, brutal trench warfare, reminiscent of World War I. The front lines barely move, but casualties keep mounting. There are battles with names like Bloody Ridge, Heartbreak Ridge, Pork Chop Hill. Men are dying for pieces of ground that will be abandoned as soon as the war ends. The main sticking point in the negotiations is prisoners of war. The UN side wants prisoners to be able to choose whether they return to their home countries or not. Many Chinese and North Korean prisoners don't want to go back to communist countries, and the UN says they shouldn't be forced to. The communist side insists that all prisoners must be returned, willing or not. This might seem like a minor issue, but it becomes the main obstacle to peace. Thousands of soldiers are dying while diplomats argue about this. Meanwhile, the war is devastating Korea. We sometimes forget this because we focus on the geopolitics and the military campaigns. But this war is happening in people's homes, in their cities and villages. Korea is being destroyed. American bombers are flattening North Korean cities. Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, is bombed so heavily that there's almost nothing left standing. American planes drop more bombs on North Korea than they dropped in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. The civilian death toll is staggering. Estimates vary, but probably over 2 million Korean civilians died during the war, from bombing, from disease, from starvation, from being caught in the fighting. Entire families are wiped out. Millions of people become refugees. And it's not just North Korea. South Korea suffers terribly too. Seoul changes hands 4 times during the war. Each time there's fighting, destruction, atrocities. Both sides commit war crimes. There are massacres of civilians by both North and South Korean forces. The North Koreans execute prisoners and suspected anti-communists. The South Koreans execute suspected communists and sympathizers. Millions of Koreans are displaced, separated from their families. Even today, there are families divided by the war, people who haven't seen their relatives in over 70 years. The war also has a huge impact on American society and politics. The Korean War happens during the height of McCarthyism and the Red Scare. When China enters the war and things go badly, there's a search for scapegoats. Who lost China? Who's to blame for the reversals in Korea? There's a paranoid atmosphere. People are accused of being communist sympathizers. Careers are destroyed. The Korean War feeds into this atmosphere of fear and suspicion. And then finally, in July 1953, an armistice is signed. Not a peace treaty, an armistice, a ceasefire. On July 27, 1953, the fighting stops. The border between North and South Korea is established along the current battle line, which is close to the 38th parallel, but not exactly the same. A demilitarized zone, the DMZ, is created as a buffer between the two sides, and that's where things stand to this day. The Korean War never officially ended. There's no peace treaty. North and South Korea are still technically at war, just in a state of ceasefire that's lasted for over 70 years. So what was accomplished? After 3 years of war and millions of deaths, the border is almost exactly where it was in 1950. Korea is still divided. Neither side achieved its objective. The North didn't conquer the South. The UN didn't reunify Korea. In that sense, you could call it a stalemate. But the consequences of this war are still with us today. The Korean War cemented the division of Korea into two separate countries with completely different systems. North Korea became one of the most isolated and repressive countries in the world. The Kim family, starting with Kim Il-sung, established a dynastic dictatorship that continues to this day with his grandson, Kim Jong-un. North Korea developed nuclear weapons, and the periodic crises over its nuclear program dominate headlines. South Korea, meanwhile, went through decades of authoritarian rule under Syngman Rhee and his successors, but eventually democratized and became one of the most dynamic economies in the world. Today, South Korea is a wealthy, technologically advanced democracy, while North Korea is impoverished and isolated. The contrast couldn't be more stark. The war also solidified the Cold War system in Asia. The United States maintained a large military presence in South Korea and Japan. The U.S.-South Korea alliance remains one of America's most important alliances to this day. There are still about 30,000 American troops stationed in South Korea. The war demonstrated that the United States would use military force to contain communism, which influenced American decisions to intervene in other conflicts, most notably Vietnam. For China, the Korean War was hugely significant. China fought the world's most powerful military to a stalemate. This gave China credibility as a major power and boosted Mao's prestige domestically, but it also came at an enormous cost. China suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, possibly as many as 500,000 dead. The war delayed China's economic development and kept China isolated from the West for decades. For the Soviet Union, the war was a mixed bag. On one hand, it tied down American resources and attention. On the other hand, Stalin probably didn't expect the war to escalate the way it did. The Soviets provided equipment and advisors, but they were careful to avoid direct combat with American forces. They didn't want to risk World War III any more than the Americans did. And for Korea, the war was an unmitigated catastrophe. The exact death toll will never be known, but most estimates suggest that about 3 million people died, including around 40,000 American soldiers, 500,000 Chinese soldiers, and over 2 million Korean civilians and soldiers. The infrastructure of the entire peninsula was destroyed. The psychological trauma affected generations. Families were divided, and many of those divisions continue today. So why is this called the Forgotten War? How does something this massive just slip from our collective memory? There are a few reasons. First, it came right after World War II, which was the biggest, most dramatic conflict in human history. In comparison, Korea seemed smaller, less significant. Second, it was followed by Vietnam, which was even more controversial and divisive for American society. Korea got sandwiched between these two larger conflicts and faded from public consciousness. Third, the war ended in what looked like a stalemate, There was no clear victory, no triumphant moment. The border was basically where it started. Americans liked clear, cut victories, and Korea didn't provide that. Fourth, after the war, both Koreas tried to move forward. In South Korea, the focus was on rebuilding and economic development. In North Korea, the Kim regime constructed its own mythological narrative of the war. Neither side wanted to dwell too much on the actual events. But here's why we shouldn't forget this war. Understanding the Korean War is essential to understanding modern East Asian politics. Every time there's a crisis with North Korea, every time they test a missile or make threats, that's a direct legacy of this war. The tensions between North and South Korea, the presence of American troops in the region, the nuclear standoff, all of this traces back to 1950 to 1953. The Korean War showed the world that the Cold War could turn hot, that nuclear powers could fight each other through proxies, and that limited wars could stay limited even when the stakes were incredibly high. The war also teaches us important lessons about how conflicts escalate. Neither side wanted World War III, but there were multiple moments when it could have happened. If MacArthur had gotten his way and expanded the war to China, who knows what would have happened? If nuclear weapons had been used, would the Soviets have responded? The restraint shown by both sides, despite the rhetoric and the tension, probably prevented a much larger catastrophe. There's also an important lesson here about the dangers of miscalculation. The war happened partly because both sides miscalculated. The North thought the US wouldn't intervene. The US thought China wouldn't intervene. Both were wrong, and millions of people paid the price for those miscalculations. It's a reminder that in international relations, you can't just assume what other countries will do. You have to take their stated positions seriously and think carefully about how your actions might be perceived. For the Korean people, this war remains intensely personal even 70 years later. There are still families divided by the DMZ, people who haven't seen their relatives since 1953. Occasionally, the two Koreas have arranged brief family reunions and the scenes are heartbreaking. Elderly people meeting siblings or cousins they haven't seen in decades, knowing they'll probably never see them again. The war created wounds that still haven't healed. It's worth noting that in recent years, there have been some attempts at reconciliation between North and South Korea. There have been summits between leaders, talks about formally ending the war, even brief moments when it seemed like real progress might be possible. But so far, nothing has fundamentally changed. The DMZ is still there, one of the most heavily militarized borders in the world. North and South Korea are still technically at war. The conflict that began in June 1950 continues in a sense to this day. So when we call this the Forgotten War, what we're really saying is that we've forgotten to learn its lessons. We've forgotten the human cost of division and conflict. We've forgotten how quickly a regional conflict can escalate into something much larger. We've forgotten the importance of diplomacy, restraint, and careful calculation in international affairs. We've forgotten that wars, even limited wars, even wars that end in stalemate, have consequences that echo through generations. The Korean War matters. It shaped the world we live in today. Every time you see news about North Korea's nuclear program, every time there's tension on the Korean Peninsula, every time you think about the American military presence in Asia, you're seeing the legacy of this conflict. It's not forgotten because it's unimportant. It's forgotten because it's uncomfortable, because it doesn't fit into a neat narrative of American victory or clear-cut triumph of good over evil. It's messy, complicated, and tragic. But that's exactly why we need to remember it. History isn't just about the triumphant moments. It's about understanding the complex, difficult realities of human conflict. It's about learning from mistakes. It's about recognizing that every war, no matter how justified it might seem at the time, has costs that go far beyond the battlefield. The soldiers who fought in Korea, from all sides, deserve to be remembered. The civilians who suffered and died deserve to be remembered. The families still divided by the DMZ deserve to have their story told. The Korean War was fought in a small peninsula in East Asia over 70 years ago. But its relevance hasn't faded. As long as North and South Korea remain divided, as long as nuclear tensions persist on the Korean Peninsula, as long as we live in a world where major powers can come into conflict, this war remains relevant. It's a reminder of what can happen when diplomacy fails, when miscalculations occur, when ideological divisions become more important than human lives. So maybe it's time we stopped calling it the Forgotten War. Maybe it's time we made sure that this conflict, with all its lessons and warnings, stays in our collective memory, because the only thing more dangerous than remembering a war is forgetting it. When we forget wars, we risk repeating them. When we forget the costs of conflict, we make it easier to stumble into new ones. The Korean War may have ended in 1953, but its lessons are timeless. Thank you so much for watching. If this video helped you understand the Korean War better, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like me to cover. History isn't just about dates and battles, it's about understanding how we got to where we are today. And the Korean War, the so-called forgotten conflict, is a crucial part of that story. I'll see you in the next video. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.